this point, I would like to invite another dear friend, Professor Nyongo. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I'm really lucky to come after 5 minutes of talking, and David, I could easily cop out and say they have said everything, but since Gabriel paid for my way coming here, I think I won't have the luxury of doing so. So I will have to at least say something. But let me say the following. First, I apologize for not having been here last year. There were some problems of logistics which made it difficult, as Gabriel remembers, for me to be here. But I'm really glad to be here this time. When I was asked to come and talk, I had a telephone conversation with Gabriel, and I asked really, what do you want me to talk about? Because the topic is rather wide, and we struck an agreement, which I hope Gabriel will keep, that I should talk about processes of democratization in general, asking and answering 3 major questions. 1, where have we come from? And 2, where are we today? And finally, where are we going in broad? Those questions. In answering where we have come from, I was requested to focus on the following. Not what we think democracy is, but what has been the agenda for democratization in Africa up to today. Because it is the agenda for democratization that gives us what, in the African context, democracy has been. It is not as if you can think around the table and define democracy and then look for it in Africa. But indeed, the democratic agenda has been there, and people have fought for it, and it has shaped the history of democratization as far as we are concerned. Like Marx once said, philosophers have described the world in various ways. The point, however, to change it. I think the history of democratization in Africa shows how the democratization agenda has been put on the table, and the issues that people have fought for, almost to the point of losing their lives. So to me, that's what I want to address. And I'll be very brief. So my paper is going to be democratization, democratic processes, and outcomes in Africa. Some reflections. It's exactly 30 years today since we published our book, Popular Struggles for Democracy in Africa, at a time when the prospects for democratization in Africa still looked rather gloomy. This book, in which many African scholars contributed, came in the middle of intense debates within the framework of Codestria, or the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, and the Third World Forum on the state, democracy, and social transformation in Africa, which had started in the early 70s. Contrary to the World Bank or IMF stand that assumed that the post-colonial state could be successfully transformed from within through such projects as the structural adjustment programs, most progressive African intellectuals saw the post-colonial state as having outlived its time. There was tremendous faith in most of us regarding the prospects for democratization in Africa, the rebellion of the popular masses, and subsequent emergence of what has been called the national, democratic, and developmental state in Africa. Controversial and perhaps polemical as these debates were, they had the following effects on intellectual discourse and political practice in Africa. First, they emboldened progressive intellectuals to use university campuses much more assertively to teach about and hold public lectures on democratization as a necessary condition for social progress in Africa. Student unions and organizations took up the messages and became radicalized, quite frequently locking horns with state authorities, leading to the expulsion from the universities or the arrest or detention without trial for both staff and student leaders across several campuses in Africa. Very often, universities were closed for months while the authoritarian political systems sought for ways to de-radicalize the universities, initiatives that very often led to the virtual death of social science faculties. Second, these debates and their subsequent impact on university life, while destabilizing the radical academia, actually drove them right into the center of political praxis. Some of those who went into exile while still pursuing their academic careers in foreign universities got practically involved in the politics of change in their own countries, joining hands with nationalists, career politicians, clerics, civil society organizers, and trade unions. By the way, I like to distinguish between clerics and religion. Clerics are individuals who believe in certain faith, belong to certain religions, but may not necessarily support the traditions of those religions. They use their positions to interpret religion for social progress. In Latin America, they were called people like, what was that name? They were called, I can't quite remember the term. But anyway, clerics and religion to me are two separate things. If you're looking at the position of religious orders, like the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church on democratization, you may find that the Anglican Church as an establishment is very conservative. And quite often in the history of Kenya or other countries has taken very reactionary stance regarding democracy. But clerics within that church do not necessarily follow the tradition of that church. Quite often, like Timothy Njoya has experienced in Kenya, he becomes an outcast in the Presbyterian church because of his stance on democracy. So when I talk about religion and politics, I would like to distinguish between clerics and religion, just by the way. Second, these debates and their subsequent impact in university life are that or not. Notably among those who are intellectuals from Ghana, Nigeria, from Africa, and Uganda, and Kenya. Those who did not get engaged in practical politics continued to write political treatises, even as novels and fictions, in contribution to the democratic struggle. Notable among these are Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Okoth Bitek, academics who fell out of favor with their own governments. Ngugi was detained and went into exile, and they continued to use the pen to support democratization and define the democratic struggle in African terms. By the time the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, the pressure for democratization in Africa had almost reached a crescendo in countries like Kenya in 1989. The Prime Minister here had been detained for about 9 or so years, and while in detention, the struggle was building, and by the time he left detention, he found a situation which is slightly better than when he went in, with a constituency of Democrats which had grown in universities, outside it, and among clerics. It is therefore erroneous to characterize the flowering of democratization processes in Africa in the early 90s as an outcome of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was not. That event, no doubt, changed the global environment in favor of the democratic forces in Africa, in that it pulled the rug from below the feet of the incumbent autocrats. It was, for example, no longer necessary for the US government to maintain Mobutu in power as an ally against the spread of communism in Africa. Communism had been made irrelevant by the disintegration of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. The same fate befell Daniel Arap Moi in Kenya. Quite out of character, a conservative Republican ambassador in the name of Smith Hempstead became the fiercest critic of Moi and a welcome ally to the pro-democracy movement in Kenya in the early 1990s. It could perhaps be argued that a sudden change in the international environment in favor of democratization in Africa created a premature atmosphere for elections as a transition to democracy before the pro-democracy forces had adequately prepared themselves to take state power and institutionalize democracy. The pro-democracy forces were quite often manipulated by the incumbent regimes to take part in elections where the electoral rules of the game, electoral politics, and the role of state institutions in elections favored the incumbent regimes in the semi-competitive elections in the early 90s. It has been argued, and quite rightly so, that the struggle over democratic elections is first and foremost a struggle over the rules of the game before it is a struggle to win the majority of the votes in a free and fair competitive process. The Constitution and the election rules and regulations can create or deny the enabling environment for free and fair democratic elections. For example, in December 1992 and in 1997, the combined votes of the opposition political parties in Kenya were double those which Daniel Arap Moi received to win the presidency. In 1992, all the commissioners in the Electoral Commission were Moi appointees. Hence, they were very likely to be biased in refereeing the elections. Indeed, they were. In 1997, half of the commissioners were appointed by the opposition political parties following the reforms of the election rules that preceded the 1997 elections. However, the constitutional provision that the party that wins the presidential elections by a simple majority forms the government remained intact. That the so-called winner-take-all is a majoritarian system was still prevailing in Kenya in spite of the reforms of 1997. That very element of the Constitution made it possible for Moi to win, notwithstanding the reforms that had been taken in 1997. Hence Moi, having won just over 30% of the vote and controlling parliament with a slim margin due to constituency gerrymandering, took it all as far as forming the government was concerned. In December 2002, without any change in constitutional provisions and election rules, the opposition political party became wiser in facing the Moi regime in that year's elections. They formed a broad national democratic coalition just before the elections and defeated Moi's presidential candidate, Uhuru Kenyatta, in that year's elections under the National Rainbow Coalition, which, among other things, was crafted by the Prime Minister here and his colleagues. Some commentators have argued that Uhuru was defeated because he was not the incumbent president. Likewise, such commentators contend an equally broad national democratic coalition that the Orange Democratic Movement was in 2007 could not have defeated Uhuru were he to be the incumbent. Well, that argument is contentious. What such commentators forget to add is that the Kibaki government had to go an extra mile also. In 2007, the Kibaki government had to go an extra mile of subverting the results of that year's election, knowing full well that they had lost the election. In other words, it is not the issue of incumbency that is at issue. It's the issue of what the incumbent does after the elections or in the course of the elections. In the year 2002, Moi did not interfere with the results of that election, perhaps because he was not the incumbent. But even not being the incumbent, he could nonetheless have interfered. But there are other reasons that I cannot go into that made it difficult for him to interfere. In 2007, although the opposition won the election, the Kibaki government still interfered with the results and subverted the results to their favor. Now that's a long story, but I just want to underpin that the issue in incumbency is not at stake here. The issue that is at stake is to what extent do the incumbent or non-incumbent capable of interfering in the electoral results when they're announced. And I'll come back, I'll cover that later. This indeed is what caused the post-election popular resistance, even before the violence followed, perpetrated at first by the state, as the Prime Minister pointed out. The point is already made. And this point is, as long as the institutional, I think this is what David is trying to make, as long as the institutional prerequisites for holding democratic elections are absent or wanting, as long as the rules of the game are wanting or inadequate, and as long as the apparatus of the state interfered vastly in the electoral process, free and fair elections will always likely to be jeopardized, compromised, or altogether subverted. So the issue, I think, that David pushed quite convincingly, and the Prime Minister also pointed out, in order to hold free and fair democratic elections, there are certain political prerequisites to holding that election that must prevail. I think David went to a great extent to explain that. I just want to emphasize that. In both cases, in the case of Kenya, in 2007 and 2013, those institutional prerequisites were still inadequate to ensure the outcome of free and fair elections. And that is why, after 2013, the role of the opposition has been, how do we strengthen the institutional prerequisite for holding free and fair elections by constitutional reform or entrenching those institutions in the Constitution, hoping full well that subsequently the Constitution will be respected. And I'll come to that also later. But it's important, first and foremost, to win the battle of the rules of the game and to win the battle over institutional prerequisites for holding free and fair elections. So let me repeat. The point, however, is already made. And this point is, as long as the institutional prerequisites for holding democratic elections are absent or wanting, as long as the rules of the game are wanting or inadequate, and as long as the apparatus of the state interfere adversely in the electoral process, free and fair elections will always likely to be jeopardized, compromised, or altogether subverted. The outcome is not only semi-competitive elections, which produce generally non-democratic government, quite often illegitimate though tolerated, but also political environment in which socioeconomic progress continues to be uncertain or difficult to attain, while poverty and social conflicts, even civil wars, find fertile ground to rival society. The perfect example is Southern Sudan, where there are no institutions to run, maintain, and manage the outcome of elections. The outcome can be as disastrous as the situation we find in Southern Sudan today. Just over a year ago from today, I gave a keynote address to the Africa Trade and Economic Conference at the University of Nairobi, School of Business, on the topic, on what does development really depend? In which I made the following observations. One, that a good number of scholars studying economic history, particularly the history of economic development since the Industrial Revolution, in particular, David Landis and Hiroki Nogami, have argued that peace and legitimate governance constitute socio-political conditions necessary for economic growth and development, and the elimination of poverty and one social conflict. Such social conditions would be characterized as follows. One, the growth of productive forces and technology, which is more likely in societies generating surplus for capital accumulation and the expanded reproduction of capital. Two, transferring the understanding of production to younger generations. Three, selecting and promoting personnel on the basis of performance. Four, affording opportunities for individual as well as group endeavors. And five, allowing people to enjoy the fruits of their own labor. To create such social conditions, argue Landis and Nogami. Nogami summarizes the work of Landis as arguing that such a society has to accomplish the following. First, secure rights of private property to encourage saving and investment. 2, secure personal liberty. 3, enforce rights of contract. 4, maintain political stability, which does not necessarily have to be by democratic means. 4 or 5, sustain a government that is responsive to social grievances. 6, treat people equitably and not favor some over others by nepotism, clanism, tribalism, racialism, sexism, religious bigotry, and so on. And finally, have an efficient and effective government. In other words, as you prepare to sustain democratic institutions in order to build democracy, and I think I go back to David again, economic and social change is also necessary to buttress democracy. And this is why African scholars have argued for the necessity of promoting and defending what we call a national democratic and developmental state. It must be national, it must be democratic, it must be developmental. Because democracy cannot be treated as a value in and of itself. It's a value that is reinforced, encouraged, and built through nation building and development. The 2010 Kenyan Constitution is therefore in this regard very important. The 2010 Kenyan Constitution broadly creates a very sound, appropriate framework for choosing a democratic government through free and fair elections. It also provides for the coming into being of state institutions that can help sustain both democracy as well as social progress. The problem, however, is whether government produced by such elections are likely or not to create and sustain democracy and social progress, or are more likely to undermine the Constitution and engage in retrogressive political and social practices. And this is where the political culture and leadership comes in. To have a constitution is not enough. There must be a deliberate effort to create a political culture and democratic leadership. And here we can learn from the German experience. After the Second World War, if you notice in Germany, every political party has a foundation whose mission it is to create leadership and nurture a certain political culture with regard to the various political parties' ideologies. So, the Social Democrats have their foundation, the Conservatives have their foundation, the Greens have their foundation, and this in respect to the fact that democracy must accept and tolerate political pluralism and ideological competition. Now, in Africa, this is something that must be nurtured. Just as we were coming in, the Prime Minister, we were commenting about the Truman institution, and then we need such institutions in Africa to nurture democracy. Because democracy does not fall like manna from heaven. It was produced by history, and history is deliberately created by people. In July 2016, in a keynote address at the 25th Congress of the International Political Science Association, I pointed out that even when constitutional reforms are undertaken to create viable frameworks for democratic election in Africa, such reforms are no guarantee that free and fair elections will be held. Even when they are held, the results of such elections may not be accurately and correctly announced. Even if the results are announced, the true winners may not necessarily assume state power easily. For example, the government. Even if they assume state power, entrenched local and global interests may not tolerate them to pursue the transformative policies needed to change their societies for the better. There is still work in progress, locally and internationally, to institutionalize the political culture of respecting, sustaining, and reproducing democratic elections in Africa. Further, purportedly democratic elections have not necessarily produced democratic governments over the last 3 decades, except for Benin, Ghana, Mauritius, Botswana, Cape Verde, and Namibia, all of which are relatively small in terms of population, are not regarded as key players in African politics. and their unique histories of better political hygiene by their respective leaders. I mean, there are countries which have had better political hygiene than other countries. You may ask yourself, why is it therefore that in bigger countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Nigeria, the democracy or democratization still is a major work in progress, where in smaller countries like Mauritius, Benin, and Botswana, democratization is more advanced, democratic institutions perhaps more entrenched. For the most part, Africa is being ruled by elected autocrats, while democratic forces, or leaders of democratic forces, like the Prime Minister here, or Kizza Besigye of Uganda, remain on the warpath for democratic change. As a working process, therefore, such institutions like the Africa Peer Review Mechanism should, along with the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, extend their mandates to cover prospects for democratization in Africa and give objective annual reports on these. Mere awarding of prizes to presidents who have performed well in office by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, in my own estimation, humble as it is not good enough. Educating the African people on what road we are traveling on regarding democratization will help us create the systems, institutions, and political cultures we need to build and sustain democracy in Africa. Thank you very much.